The month of August 1914 represents one of the most catastrophic failures of political, military, and psychological judgment in modern history. What began as a localized assassination in Sarajevo, the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie, quickly escalated into a continent-wide crisis, in large part because European leaders misread the situation and misjudged the consequences. Of their rigid alliance systems, each government assumed that any conflict could be contained, that diplomacy would work under pressure, and that their military plans were foolproof. The reality, however, was entirely different. The web of alliances and mobilization timetables transformed a regional incident into a global conflagration. The first failure lay in perception. Austria-Hungary viewed the assassination as both a personal insult and a challenge to its authority in the Balkans. Leaders in Vienna were convinced that swift, punitive action against Serbia would restore honor and deter future nationalist uprisings. This overconfidence ignored the complexity of European alliances. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, offered the infamous blank check of support, effectively committing itself to back Vienna, regardless of the consequences. Leaders in Berlin assumed that their rapid mobilization and modern military organization would deter Russia and France from intervening, misjudging both their opponents' resolve and the domino effect their support would trigger. Meanwhile, Russia, seeing itself as the protector of Slavic nations, interpreted Austrian action as a direct threat. Moscow began partial mobilization against Austria-Hungary and, by extension, Germany. Germany, observing Russian mobilization, activated the Schlieffen-Plana military strategy that assumed a two-front war was inevitable and required immediate preemptive action. The plan called for a rapid invasion of Belgium and France, intending to knock out France before Russia could fully mobilize. German leaders believed that speed and surprise would guarantee victory. They assumed that the violation of Belgian neutrality would be tolerated, or that Britain would remain neutral, underestimating the geopolitical consequences of their aggression. Britain, bound by treaty obligations to defend Belgium and concerned about the balance of power, responded quickly once German forces crossed the border. What many European leaders had envisioned as a contained regional conflict had now escalated into a fully international war. Mobilization orders and military timetables were rigid and irreversible. Once trains began moving and soldiers left their barracks, diplomacy became almost impossible. The perception that war could be localized collided with the reality of modern industrialized militaries, whose operational requirements demanded immediate action or risk catastrophic delay. The speed of mobilization turned what could have been a political crisis into a military inevitability. The psychological dimension of the crisis is critical. Leaders across Europe displayed a combination of overconfidence, rigidity, and cognitive bias. They assumed that their armies were invincible, that their plans accounted for all variables, and that other powers would behave predictably. The egos of monarchs and generals created a dangerous feedback loop. No leader wanted to appear weak or indecisive. So each escalation was justified as a necessary demonstration of strength. Austria-Hungary's initial ultimatum to Serbia was deliberately harsh, intended to force compliance while signaling authority. Germany's encouragement amplified this pressure, signaling that any hesitation would be a sign of weakness. Russia, France, and Britain responded in kind, each fearing that yielding would compromise national honor. This mutual reinforcement of arrogance ensured that rational negotiation was sidelined in favor of performative displays of military resolve. The month also illustrates the lethal consequences of pre-existing military doctrines. The rigid planning of Germany's Schlieffen Plan assumed a war that could not tolerate delay or diplomatic interference. Russia's mobilization plans operated on strict timetables that ignored political nuance. Austria-Hungary, attempting to leverage its army for a swift punitive action, did not anticipate that its aggression would force neighboring powers into the conflict. France, operating under the assumption that Germany would honor neutrality or that Belgium could be ignored, scrambled to deploy troops in a defensive posture. Each plan assumed a static environment, but in reality, the political landscape was dynamic and volatile. The collision of these rigid frameworks produced a war that no leader could stop once it had begun. August 1914 also exposed the limitations of diplomacy under pressure. Ambassadors, ministers, and monarchs attempted negotiations, even as mobilization schedules made concessions irrelevant. Germany's preemptive invasion of Belgium rendered any discussion moot. Once armies were en route and railways activated, war became inevitable. Diplomacy failed not because of lack of intelligence or communication, but because the psychological and operational constraints of modern militaries created a situation where stopping the engines of war was almost impossible. Leaders had created a structure that prioritized speed and rigidity over deliberation and flexibility. And the result was catastrophic. The human cost of this miscalculation was immediate and staggering. Millions of soldiers were mobilized within weeks, many of them unprepared for the industrialized warfare that awaited them. The initial battles, from the invasion of Belgium to the fighting in Alsace-Lorraine, revealed the lethality of modern weaponry and the inadequacy of pre-war tactical doctrines. Casualty reports reached unprecedented levels within days, and yet leaders remained committed to plans that were failing. National pride and fear of appearing weak outweighed any consideration of re-evaluating strategy, amplifying the destruction, and ensuring that the war would not remain short. The rapid escalation of August 1914 demonstrates the interplay between psychological, political, and operational failures. Overconfidence in military plans, underestimation of allies' resolve, cognitive biases among leaders, and the inflexibility of mobilization schedules combined to produce a global conflict that no one truly desired, but everyone felt compelled to fight. The short summer vacation that European leaders took in July became a symbol of catastrophic misjudgment, while the elite lounged on beaches, and in palaces, the machinery of war was quietly mobilizing, making the continent a tinderbox. In sum, August 1914 exemplifies how small triggers a single assassination can cascade into global catastrophe. When combined with rigid planning, psychological blind spots, and alliance obligations, the July crisis was not merely a diplomatic failure. It was a structural and systemic collapse of European governance, military thought, and psychological judgment. The month set in motion a war that would devastate an entire generation and reshape the political, cultural, and technological landscape of the 20th century. The short-sighted assumptions, collective arrogance, and operational rigidity of European leaders ensured that what might have been a contained Balkan conflict instead became the First World War, the apocalypse of the 19th century, and the precursor to even greater upheavals in decades to come. Liking, commenting, and subscribing to Dumb Historian ensures you stay connected to these deep analyses of the moments when egos, errors, and miscalculations reshaped the world forever. The web of alliances in Europe in 1914 was a ticking time bomb, one that no one truly understood until it exploded in August. The July crisis, sparked by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was merely the spark. The pre-existing alliances were the dry tinder that turned a local fire into a continental inferno. The psychological and structural dynamics of these treaties created a situation where individual decisions could no longer be assessed in isolation. Every political move had cascading consequences. In the moment Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, the dominoes began to fall. Austria-Hungary, seeking to punish Serbia and assert dominance in the Balkans, issued an ultimatum with deliberately harsh terms. The leadership in Vienna assumed that Serbia would either comply or be swiftly defeated, and that the larger European powers would remain uninvolved. This assumption ignored both the psychological and strategic reality of alliances. Serbia was under the implicit protection of Russia, a self-appointed guardian of Slavic nations. The Russian government interpreted Vienna's aggression not just as a regional dispute, but as a direct threat to its influence and credibility. Mobilization orders began almost immediately, creating a fixed timetable that could not easily be reversed. Germany's role exemplified the fatal rigidity of alliance obligations. By offering the infamous blank check to Austria-Hungary, Berlin committed itself fully to Vienna's course of action. This was not a casual endorsement. It was a psychological contract that removed any possibility for Austria-Hungary to pause or reconsider its aggressive stance. German leadership assumed that their military plans, particularly the Schlieffen Plan, would deter Russian action and intimidate France into compliance or neutrality. They believed that their numerical and technological superiority, coupled with the speed of mobilization, would allow them to control the escalation. In reality, this created a pressure cooker scenario where any delay or hesitation could be interpreted as weakness. forcing leaders toward increasingly aggressive choices. Russia, observing Austria-Hungary's attack on Serbia, interpreted the aggression as both a threat and an obligation. The alliance network, combined with nationalistic pride and the perceived duty to protect fellow Slavs, drove rapid mobilization against Austria-Hungary. Once mobilization began, it triggered a near-automatic response from Germany, which considered Russian mobilization a declaration of hostility. Here, the psychological factor of ego and honor intertwined with operational rigidity. No leader could safely appear indecisive, and once armies were moving along fixed schedules, diplomatic flexibility vanished. Germany's military timetables demanded immediate action, and the psychological fear of looking weak ensured that political leaders continued down a path toward war. France's involvement further amplified the chain reaction. Bound by alliance to Russia, France could not remain passive while Russian forces mobilized. Military plans assumed that Germany would act first, and that rapid mobilization was essential to gain the initiative. French leaders, motivated by both national pride and fear of encirclement, moved their forces in response. These actions in turn confirmed German assumptions of a continental threat. Justifying preemptive strategies like the Schlieffen Plan, each country's decisions were now locked into a feedback loop, where perceived threats justified escalations that, in reality, were responses to the initial fear of escalation itself. Britain, although initially hesitant, was drawn in by both treaty obligations and strategic calculation. The Treaty of London, 1839, bound Britain to protect Belgian neutrality. When Germany invaded Belgium as part of the Schlieffen Plan, Britain could no longer remain neutral without appearing weak or dishonorable. Psychological factors such as national honor, fear of being outmaneuvered, and the need to maintain credibility in international politics forced Britain to declare war. This final step transformed what some leaders might have considered a manageable European war into a global conflict, as colonies and dominions were automatically drawn into the war effort. The alliance network created a situation in which individual decisions could not be made independently. Each government's calculations were conditioned by assumptions about what other powers would or would not do. No leader trusted that their actions would be interpreted as benign. Every military or diplomatic move carried the risk of triggering a proportional or preemptive response. The psychological weight of honor, reputation, and fear of appearing weak made compromise difficult. And once mobilization timetables began, war became a mathematical certainty. The human mind, wired to avoid the embarrassment of failure and maintain the image of strength, inadvertently locked entire nations into a destructive spiral. The speed and inflexibility of mobilization plans were particularly important. Unlike previous centuries, modern industrialized armies required precise schedules for train movements, supply lines, and deployment of artillery. Delays could lead to catastrophic vulnerabilities. This operational rigidity meant that the moment one nation began mobilization, others had no choice but to follow, regardless of ongoing diplomatic negotiations. Psychological fear, intertwined with logistical necessity, turned rational leaders into agents of an unstoppable escalation. Moreover, the interconnected alliances amplified misunderstandings. A local move by Austria-Hungary was interpreted as a continental threat by Russia, whose actions were then read by Germany as evidence of Russian aggression. France's subsequent mobilization validated German fears of encirclement. Each nation reacted to perceived threats, not actual intentions, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The psychological interplay of fear, pride, and preemptive reasoning made rational assessment nearly impossible. By the time Britain entered the war, the network of alliances had transformed a Balkan crisis into a full-scale global conflict. In effect, the chain reaction of alliances acted as both psychological and operational handcuffs. Leaders could not back down without appearing weak, and armies could not halt once mobilization had begun. This dual constraint, God-driven decision-making and logistical rigidity ensured that the war would be all-encompassing. The July crisis was not a failure of a single state, but a systemic collapse of European governance, where the combination of honor, fear, and pre-committed obligations created a situation from which there was no escape. The lesson of this chain reaction is clear. Alliances, while intended as deterrents, can become accelerators when combined with human ego and inflexible planning. The very mechanism designed to prevent conflict instead guaranteed it, demonstrating that psychological perception, not objective threat, often drives strategic outcomes. Austria-Hungary's initial decision triggered a cascade, but the speed and inevitability of subsequent actions turned a regional crisis into a continental catastrophe in mere weeks. The rigid interconnection of treaties, coupled with human biases and fear, ensured that the short summer of 1914 became the gateway to a world at war. The August 1914 chain reaction underscores how modern warfare is as much about psychology and perception as it is about strategy and logistics. Each leader's fear of appearing weak, combined with strict alliance obligations, created a scenario where every small move had disproportionately large consequences. The Balkan assassination was merely the spark. The alliances were the accelerant that made the fire uncontrollable. Nations, armies, and populations became trapped in a preordained escalation, highlighting how human cognition, pride, and inflexibility can shape global events far more than any single tactical decision. The third factor that transformed a regional crisis into a global catastrophe was the rigid, almost mechanical approach to mobilization. By 1914, European armies were no longer simple forces that could march at will. They were industrialized, bureaucratically organized machines, dependent on rail networks, prepositioned supplies, and precise timetables. The planners assumed that war would be short, decisive, and dictated by speed. This assumption created a mindset where the act of mobilizing was effectively irreversible because any delay or reversal was seen as a strategic disaster. Germany's Schlieffen Plan is the most famous example of this inflexibility. The plan required a lightning strike against France through neutral Belgium to quickly knock France out of the war before turning east to confront Russia. Once the plan was activated, the logic of the timetable dictated that every train, regiment, and artillery unit move according to a fixed schedule. German generals believed that failing to adhere strictly to the schedule would give the French time to regroup and ultimately doom the campaign. Diplomacy, which might have slowed the escalation or allowed for negotiation, was effectively sidelined. The psychological effect on leaders was profound. They could not appear indecisive or hesitant, and the fear of being blamed for strategic failure overrode any consideration of pausing or reversing mobilization. This rigid timetable created a psychological trap for every major power. Russian mobilization, once initiated to support Serbia, could not easily be halted without the appearance of weakness, which in the eyes of German leaders could justify preemptive attacks. Similarly, French forces mobilized in response to Russia, locking Germany into further aggressive action. The military logistics, combined with the fear of losing face, meant that the leaders were literally afraid to press the stop button. The mobilization clock, once started, dictated not just military movements, but political decisions as well, creating a situation where war became virtually inevitable. The complexity of these mobilization plans further amplified the problem. Each Army S plan relied on assumptions about the enemy S movements and the punctuality of their own forces. Delaying one regiment could cascade into gaps in the front line, misaligned artillery, and logistical chaos. This operational rigidity made any last-minute diplomatic intervention nearly impossible. Leaders understood the technical necessity of continuous movement, but they also internalized the psychological pressure of appearing competent. The combination of technical and ego-driven imperatives ensured that once the mobilization process began, war was locked in. Neutral countries like Belgium were drawn into this cycle because the plans assumed predictable behavior from every state in the theater. Germany's decision to violate Belgian neutrality was not merely strategic. It was a timetable-driven requirement to outflank France. The plan could not work otherwise. Once executed, this violation forced Britain into the war due to treaty obligations. Here again, human psychology amplified structural constraints. The fear of slowing down, appearing weak, or disrupting carefully calculated timetables made compromise politically and militarily unthinkable. The psychological impact on leaders was compounded by the belief in the inevitability of war. Once mobilization began, political figures were pressured to conform to military logic, even when personal instincts or diplomatic opportunities suggested restraint. Military necessity, intertwined with fear of personal disgrace, created a feedback loop. Generals urged political leaders to act. Political leaders feared indecision, and each incremental step validated the need for the next. By the time Europe fully understood the scope of the crisis, the mobilization wheels were already turning too fast to stop. Even the scale of industrial armies made reversal almost impossible. Millions of men were called up simultaneously, requiring housing, transport, and food. Artillery units and munitions were being moved along predetermined rail schedules. The economic and logistical investment in mobilization created a sunk cost mentality. Stopping the process halfway would waste enormous resources and be seen as a failure of both planning and national resolve. In this way, the mobilization clock did not just dictate military movement, it dictated political inevitability. The rigidity of mobilization plans also amplified the domino effect of alliances. Austria-Hungary's attack on Serbia triggered Russian mobilization. The German military, interpreting Russian mobilization as an immediate threat, accelerated their timetable. French mobilization followed Russian, and Britain entered when Germany violated Belgium. In each case, the psychological pressure to maintain momentum combined with operational necessity, creating a situation where diplomatic intervention became almost impossible. Each nation's fear of being too slow or indecisive made the mechanical logic of the mobilization clock act as a driver toward full-scale war. The inflexibility of mobilization created a crisis where leadership and strategy were subordinated to schedules. The general's literal fear of pressing the stop button exemplifies how technical planning, ego, and psychological pressure combined to force irreversible escalation. Diplomacy, negotiation, or measured restraint were no longer viable options once mobilization began. The military clock dictated the rhythm of political life, and the human cost of adhering to rigid plans became unavoidable. In effect, the mobilization clock transformed a local assassination into a continental war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand would not have led to a global conflict if armies could have paused, reconsidered, or recalibrated. But by mid-August 1914, the timetables were locked, the alliances triggered, and leaders trapped by both operational necessity and psychological pressure. The fear of being wrong, of failing to appear decisive, combined with the mechanical requirements of moving millions of troops, made the war inevitable. It was not only a failure of diplomacy, but a failure of human psychology under the pressure of technological and bureaucratic constraints. The fourth critical misstep in the escalation of August 1914 was Germany's deliberate violation of Belgian neutrality. Belgium had been guaranteed protection under the 1839 Treaty of London, and the nation's neutrality was widely recognized as inviolable. By moving troops across Belgium, Germany instantly transformed a regional conflict into a wider European and, eventually, global war. The invasion provided the United Kingdom with a clear, legally justified reason to enter the conflict. Britain's foreign policy was anchored on maintaining the balance of power in Europe, and German occupation of Belgian territory threatened both strategic ports on the Channel and the integrity of international law. The psychological effect on the British government was immense. Allowing Germany to advance unopposed would have been perceived as weakness, both domestically and internationally. Military planners and politicians feared that failing to act would embolden Germany in the future, so they mobilized immediately. The German disregard for Belgian sovereignty also shocked public opinion across Europe. International outrage fueled recruitment, solidified alliances, and eliminated the possibility of neutrality for other smaller nations. Countries that might have remained on the sidelines were psychologically and politically pushed to take sides. The German leadership had underestimated the moral and reputational impact of violating a neutral nation. Believing their operational efficiency would justify the act, instead, they ignited a wider conflict, as the violation signaled that no treaties could be relied upon and that military ambition trumped diplomatic norms. From a military perspective, the violation was both necessary and fatal according to the German timetable. The Schlieffen Plan depended on rapid movement through Belgium to bypass heavily fortified French positions. German generals prioritized speed over strategic foresight. Assuming that Britain might not intervene, or that Belgium's resistance would be minimal. In practice, Belgian forces mounted unexpected resistance, slowing the German advance and causing delays that had cascading effects on the overall timetable. The dumb decision to ignore neutral guarantees thus created both operational friction and a strategic nightmare. It drew Britain into the war, disrupted the planned schedule, and forced Germany to fight a multi-front conflict far earlier than anticipated. The psychological dimension of this decision is key. German leaders were trapped by their own adherence to rigid mobilization plans. Fearing that altering the route would compromise the campaign, they were psychologically conditioned to prioritize apparent efficiency over the broader consequences of diplomatic violations. This inflexibility mirrored other failures of August 1914, where leaders' fear of appearing indecisive amplified small mistakes into global catastrophes. The violation of Belgium was less a strategic necessity and more a symptom of a mindset where timetable and ego outweighed foresight and prudence. Once Britain declared war, the scope of the conflict expanded dramatically. The British Empire's resources, including troops from Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa, were committed to the European theater. Germany suddenly faced an opponent with not just continental power but global reach, forcing a defensive strategy on a scale they had not fully anticipated. What began as a regional crisis over Serbia became a world war because German planners failed to anticipate the moral, psychological, and political consequences of crossing Belgian territory. The violation of Belgian neutrality also had lasting strategic consequences for Germany. The time and resources spent suppressing Belgian resistance delayed the initial advance into France, contributing to the failure of the Schlieffen Plan. It strengthened the resolve of the Allied powers, allowing France and Britain to coordinate defenses and prepare for protracted conflict. In short, the dumb decision created both immediate and long-term operational setbacks, while simultaneously ensuring that the war could not remain limited or controlled. Ultimately, the invasion of Belgium demonstrates how a single, poorly considered tactical decision can have cascading geopolitical effects. Germany's focus on timetable, speed, and operational efficiency blinded its leaders to the strategic, psychological, and diplomatic ramifications. The misjudgment turned what could have been a contained European conflict into a global war, demonstrating the lethal combination of mechanical military planning and human arrogance. It underscores the principle that adherence to rigid plans, without regard for context or consequence, can convert manageable crises into historical cataclysms. The final consequence of August 1914 was not just a single war or a regional crisis, it was the ignition of a century defined by unprecedented destruction, political upheaval, and social transformation. The catastrophic decisions of that one-month rigid mobilization schedules, blind adherence to alliances, the misreading of diplomacy, and the violation of Belgian neutrality, combined with emerging military technologies, created a perfect storm. The leaders of Europe approached the crisis as if it were still the 19th century, relying on outdated doctrines, hierarchical command structures, and assumptions of limited warfare. They failed to grasp that railroads, telegraphs, machine guns, long-range artillery, and nascent air power made the scale, speed, and lethality of modern conflict fundamentally different. The immediate result was staggering. Millions of men were mobilized within weeks, thrust into industrialized slaughter on a scale never seen before. The rigid timetables that had driven mobilization turned into death schedules. Generations of young men's sons, brothers, and husbands were sent into battles where traditional tactics met modern firepower, resulting in casualties that devastated families and communities. The psychological shock of modern warfare trench conditions, chemical weapons, and mass artillery barrages was amplified by the belief among soldiers and civilians alike that war would be short and decisive. A cruelly mistaken optimism, encouraged by political leaders, empires fell. By the end of the war, the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German empires were irrevocably shattered. The political vacuum left in their wake destabilized vast regions, altering borders and creating conditions for revolutionary movements, nationalistic uprisings, and ideological conflicts. In Russia, the war catalyzed the Bolshevik Revolution, overthrowing centuries of imperial rule and introducing communism to the world stage. In the Middle East, Ottoman collapse reshaped national boundaries under colonial mandates, sowing conflicts that persist to this day. Germany, humiliated and economically crippled by defeat, became fertile ground for extremist ideologies. Setting the stage for future global conflict, the societal consequences were equally profound. The loss of a generation created demographic gaps, disrupted economies, and transformed cultural attitudes. Art, literature, and philosophy reflected the disillusionment and trauma of a population confronted with the brutal realities of mechanized war. The concept of honor and glory in battle was replaced by cynicism and skepticism toward authority. Families grappled with the absence of loved ones, entire communities mourned, and nations faced the challenge of reintegrating soldiers who had survived unimaginable horrors into civilian life. The psychological lessons of August 1914 reverberate even now. It demonstrates how decision-making under rigid structures, fear of appearing weak, and blind adherence to plans can magnify minor crises into catastrophes. Leaders' overconfidence, ego, and inability to consider the broader context transformed a localized assassination into a global conflagration. The reliance on 19th-century mental models in a 20th-century technological environment exemplified a fundamental misalignment between capability and understanding. The lesson is timeless: the intersection of human arrogance. Technological advancement and rigid planning can yield consequences far beyond what any single actor anticipates. In addition, the economic and political aftershocks of August 1914 shaped international relations for decades. Reparations, territorial disputes, and ideological divides created conditions that directly influenced the Second World War. The League of Nations, designed to prevent similar miscalculations, failed largely because the actors involved had not internalized the lessons of the First Global Industrial War. Colonial subjects, having contributed to the war effort, demanded recognition and independence, fueling anti-imperial movements worldwide. Economically, the war devastated European industry and infrastructure, leaving a vacuum for new powers, such as the United States and Japan, to rise. Even the cultural memory of August 1914 matters. The month became a symbol of systemic failure, illustrating how interconnected structures, alliances, mobilization, timetables, and political hierarchies can convert a small spark into a global inferno. Historians and strategists study it as an example of cascading failure. How individual misjudgments, amplified by collective overconfidence and technological novelty, can produce outcomes entirely unforeseen. It serves as a cautionary tale for modern governance, military planning, and international diplomacy, highlighting the cost of inflexibility and the human tendency to underestimate the scale of new challenges. Ultimately, the short summer of 1914 demonstrated the fragility of human institutions when confronted with rapid technological, social, and political change. What might have been a contained Balkan conflict became a cataclysm that reshaped the modern world. The deaths, revolutions, and geopolitical upheavals that followed were not accidents. They were the direct consequence of leadership failure, poor strategic foresight, and rigid adherence to outdated paradigms. August 1914 did not merely start a war. It started a century defined by the struggle to understand and control forces far larger than any one individual or nation. The reverberations of this single month emphasize the critical importance of foresight, adaptability, and humility in leadership. The combination of ego-driven trading, mechanical obedience to treaties, and underestimation of technological change created an environment where catastrophic outcomes were inevitable. August 1914 reminds us that history is not shaped solely by intent or ambition, but by the interaction between human error, systemic complexity, and the unforgiving realities of a changing world.